single malt Scotch. And just a little bit of background information on this Scotch. It's from the Isle of Arran. It's the only distillery on the entire island. And this one specifically has won quite a few awards around the world in different spirit competitions. So I'll pour a little tasting here for you. So we'll go over the tasting in just a bit, but wanted to introduce you to this distillery. Again, they're the only one on the Isle of Arran. This is their 10-year single malt Scotch. It's non-chill filtered, which when they talk about that, they mean that without this filtration, there are more flavors and aromas that they prefer to have in their whiskeys. And one thing you'll see with a lot of Scotch whiskey specifically is the producers talking about their water. Their water is very important, and just through tradition of a lot of it, people will argue how much importance it has in the finished product, but you have to respect how much they look to talk about it and how much they care about it. So the Arran distillery gets all of their water from Loch, Davie, and their whiskeys, I think their whiskeys are very fun to start off with, especially if you are not already a Scotch whiskey drinker, because theirs tend to show more floral and fruit aromas and not that really heavy smokiness that's pretty consistent with a lot of Scotch whiskeys. So when we taste, the reason I have two glasses here is the first thing we want to do is nose the whiskey. One neat and one will cut with water. Just because with the chemistry of how the certain chemical compounds will react, some of them show up with the water and some do not. Some may be pleasant, some may be a little bit unpleasant. So that's why we typically cut it with water, about a quarter to a third water. We'll go ahead and add that. And just a little bit back to the water. There's many in the industry, like I said, who kind of argue the importance of the water, not just where it's from, but hard versus soft water. Some will claim that soft water is more pure and capable of extracting more during mashing, while others, like Island Park, for example, use hard water, which contains more minerals that can affect the finished product. So Scotch whiskey specifically is made from barley, preferably high starch content, as the starch is needed for the sugar to convert to alcohol. The higher the protein, the lower the starch, and vice versa. So for Scotch production, we want high starch, low protein barley. Before we get into the details of the Scotch whiskey production, let's go ahead and start tasting. So with this one, right away with the one neat, I'm getting a lot of fruity, floral, kind of malt and honey notes, almost a Turkish apricot, sprinkle in it. And the color, when we look at the color, kind of looking through there, it's very similar to, say I'd compare it to an Amontillado sherry. Then when we nose the other one, the one that's cut with the water, love that one a lot more of the typical Arran floral characteristics come through, very specifically orange blossom florals with a little bit of kind of jasmine in there, more of the apricot, and there's just a touch of this almost sulfur-like note, and that's from adding the water that actually brought that out more. And this is a whiskey I have tasted before and have tasted in a typical rocks glass, and while I'm not one to always say, oh, you have to have the perfect kind of glassware, this really is a whiskey that I highly, highly recommend tasting in a whiskey glass rather than a rocks glass. If you don't have these, try a wine glass, a smaller wine glass, because more of that sulfuric note came through with the rocks glass with this whiskey specifically. Now that we nosed it, we'll go ahead and do a little bit of a taste. It's very spicy. It has even more of that peppery and prickly feel. Overall main traits I'm noticing is it is a lot of that sweetness in it, so that kind of honey-like notes in there, along with the bitter and spice. There's a lot of spice. It's kind of that fiery taste and what we would call more of an oily texture. It's quite complex. There's a lot of the florals that come out again in that citrus. It's more of that kind of lemon, peel, orange that's coming through it. And let's go ahead and try it with the water. And with the water, one of those that comes out right away is an apple, kind of a yellow apple type of note. It's very mellowed. You can more easily pick out some of the fruit notes when you cut it with that. And the honey drops off a little bit to really show the rest of it. It does help almost balance it in a way. And it's always, up to your preference. If you like drinking it neat, absolutely drink it neat. That's when you get more of that spice that really comes through. With a little bit of water, it mellows out. You can notice more of those delicate aromas and flavors coming through. So you go ahead, taste if you want to taste, and let me know what you think. And I'll just go over a little bit of production here for you so you can go ahead and taste. So the very first part of Scotch whiskey making is the malting process, which is essentially controlled germination, which includes the steeping, germination, and kilning. The barley is immersed in water 3 times before being spread out on a floor for germination. And you may have seen pictures or videos of people kind of raking grain before on these malting floors. This is done to keep the temperature even and keep the roots from becoming all tangled together. There's also pneumatic malting systems which are able to do this on a larger scale, so not many distilleries actually have their own malting floors anymore. The last part, the kilning, is the drying process, which has 3 stages: the free drying, forced drying, and cooling. The first phase is where peat, if wanted, is used. This is done at a lower smokiness. And we'll add the peat for that at the beginning. Smokiness can also come just a bit from the barley itself. So you may have an unpeated whiskey that shows just a bit of that smokiness, and if you do, that's coming from the barley itself. And so after the kilning, the barley then goes through a mill, and this mill kind of crushes it and creates grist, husk, and flour, mainly grist, discarding the latter two. And the grist goes into a mash tun with hot water. There's 3 extractions in the mash tun. The first 2 are drained and held to be used for the rest of the production, while the last one is held to be used for the first water of the next mash. And the first 2 extractions, now referred to as the worts, are chilled before entering the fermentation vessel called a washback. So if you hear the term washback, that's just the big fermentation vessel. After that, they add the yeast, and after about 2 to 3 days, you essentially have kind of a strong ale, so like a strong beer. And a shorter fermentation will tend to yield more kind of grain and cereal notes, where a longer fermentation will show more complex fruit notes. And the next process is distillation, which I think has some pretty cool components to it. The fermented liquid, or the wash, the washback fermentation vessel, the wash is the fermented liquid. It goes into a copper pot still, where it's then boiled, and the vapor passes through a copper condenser. And this is where I think it can be kind of fun, because the condenser is cooled with water, and the temperature of the water directly affects how long it takes for the vapor to turn to a liquid. And since copper is a purifier, the longer the vapor is in contact with it, the purer, so to speak, the distillate will be. So, the colder the water, the faster the process. The warmer the water, the longer the process. So cold water equals a heavier distillate, and warmer water equals a kind of purer or softer distillate. And the first stage of distillation is done to extract the alcohol, while the second distillation is about concentrating and purifying the spirit. This distillate contains many different kinds of chemical compounds. Just like in wines, we have all sorts of chemical compounds that create different kinds of flavors. Absolutely the same thing with whiskey. It's all chemistry. So, when talking about the distillate, this distillate contains many different kinds of chemical compounds responsible for the character of the whiskey, though it is up to the whiskey makers to decide what to keep and discard during the distillation. This is done by saving what's called the heart of the spirit. Some distillers choose to let it run a little longer or shorter than others, depending on the preferred style. The chemical compounds, some pleasant, some not so pleasant, found in the distillate are known as congeners, so you may hear that term a bit, congeners. More robust whiskeys tend to be left to run longer, where the organonitrogen compounds show biscuit and honey notes. If left too long, that can though quickly turn to kind of fishy and dirty aromas. Some of the earlier runnings tend to be more fruity and floral, some of the notes that we found in this Arran 10-year Scotch Whisky. In the end, only about a third of the distillate will be saved, reduced with water, filled into the casks, and aged a minimum of 3 years. So legally, to be considered Scotch Whisky, it has to be aged a minimum of 3 years, though often way longer. We see tons of 10, 12 year, 25 year, and up from there. spirit is then aged in a warehouse, either a traditional dunnage warehouse. The humidity in these warehouses allow the spirit volume to stay high while the alcohol levels will drop slightly. Or they may be aged in a modern warehouse, and these are temperature controlled, so that allows the alcohol levels to remain high, and the lack of humidity allows the volume to decrease slightly. So let me know what you've been thinking of this whiskey. Again, I think it's a really fun one to start off when you're not quite into Scotch yet. You just want to try it a little bit because it's not overwhelming with that smoky